Jay Leno, the once-in-a-generation force who ruled American late-night television with an iron grip of charisma and a heart that felt impossibly human, the iconic host whose face became a nightly ritual in millions of homes, stands today as one of the most unmovable pillars in entertainment history, a man whose 22-year reign on The Tonight Show turned ordinary evenings into unforgettable memories, as his monologues pulsed like the heartbeat of a nation, blending sharp humor with a familiar warmth that made America feel seen, understood, and comforted. Yet behind the glow of his legend lies a journey soaked in hardship and relentless struggle, a path so bruising and merciless that could have crushed almost anyone else before they ever found their footing. Leno rose from poverty and obscurity, the son of a tired insurance salesman and a tender Scottish immigrant who wrapped their tiny home in love despite the cold winds of financial stress. And although he carried a naturally comedic spirit, he was also marked early by the torment of dyslexia, a learning struggle that turned classrooms into battlefields and pages of text into enemies that mocked him. Teachers misunderstood him, classmates outpaced him, and a school guidance counselor delivered a sentence so cruel it could have shattered a child's future in a single breath. Education isn't for everybody, a verdict heavy enough to bury hope forever. But instead of collapsing under the weight of humiliation and exclusion, young Jay reached instinctively for the only weapon he had left. Laughter, not as a luxury but as a lifeline. Humor became the shield he clung to when textbooks betrayed him, the mask he wore to hide the pain of feeling slow, different, and perpetually behind everyone else. He began imitating teachers not to perform, but to protect his spirit from breaking, and with each joke he told, with each moment he managed to make someone smile instead of judge him, he discovered a spark that not only kept him afloat but slowly shaped itself into destiny. The small Andover home with peeling walls and threadbare furniture became the place where a wounded boy stitched laughter over his pain, where his mother nurtured his imagination because she sensed the storm inside him, and where his father's belief in relentless work became the armor Jay would one day wear on the biggest stage in America. Every failing grade etched more determination into him, every dismissive glance from a teacher turned into fuel, every page he couldn't decode hardened his resolve to build a life no one believed he could have. And even as he stepped into adulthood, the world did not soften its blows for him, it sharpened them. Yet he kept climbing, kept performing, kept refusing to surrender, evolving from a kid who hid behind humor into a young man who wielded it with power, grit, and an unbreakable will. The monumental confidence America would someday celebrate was forged not under spotlights, but in shadows where fear lived. The extraordinary talent that defined his career was built from the heartbreak of being underestimated, and the humor that made millions roar with laughter was born from a lifetime of learning how to survive pain with grace. And now, at 75, after conquering television, after surviving back-to-back accidents that nearly destroyed him, after losing 3 loved ones to the same vicious cancer, Jay Leno faces a new chapter even more ruthless than those before, a moment so heavy, so defining, that it forces the world to ask what happens to the man who spent decades filling every room with light, while privately carrying a silent storm the world is only now beginning to understand. If anything, life only tightened its grip around Jay Leno, as if determined to see just how much fight still lived inside the boy who had spent his childhood being underestimated. And by 1968, at only 18, he walked away from Andover High School carrying nothing but a fragile dream, a cracked but unbroken spirit, and the echo of years filled with doubt and dismissal. Stepping into the unknown with nothing guaranteed, Emerson College became the next chapter, a place where he studied speech therapy, practical on paper yet mismatched with the fire beating inside him. Because what truly throbbed at the center of his being was comedy, the instinctive need to spark laughter, the same instinct that once kept him breathing in classrooms where teachers believed he didn't belong. But Boston in the late 60s showed him no mercy. It was a city that demanded rent money he didn't have, stamina he barely possessed, and the grit of a man twice his age. Jay took any job he could grab, delivering pizzas through winds that sliced the night like glass, hauling metal in cold auto shops where grease bled into his fingerprints, and laboring in car dealerships where the scent of oil seeped into his clothes and unknowingly planted the earliest seeds of his devotion to machines. These weren't stepping stones to success, they were lifelines. Every paycheck dissolved instantly into gas, rent, and meals so cheap they sometimes failed to keep him full. And when the numbers wouldn't stretch any further, he slept in his car, an aging, rattling shell barely thicker than a soda can, shivering under Boston's brutal cold, waking to frost on his windshield, watching his own breath turn to fog, and curling his numb hands under his arms for warmth that never arrived. He wasn't officially homeless, but he lived constantly 1 inch from the edge. And yet, instead of surrendering, Jay clung to the one fragile thing that still felt like purpose. In 1973, at 23, he made his first quiet act of rebellion against every limitation thrown at him. He opened a tiny comedy club. It wasn't glamorous, it barely qualified as a venue. Mismatched chairs, a stage thinner than cardboard, a microphone that crackled like it was coughing, but it was his sanctuary. Between managing the club, dragging himself through classes, and grinding through thankless day jobs, he threw himself onto open mics across Boston, performing in smoky basements and flickering bars where neon lights buzzed like dying insects. He learned how brutal show business could be. Some nights 3 people showed up, other nights the silence after a joke weighed heavier than humiliation. Club owners dismissed him with cruel ease. "You don't have the spark, you're just ordinary," as though they were confirming a destiny carved long ago. One winter night, after standing for hours in freezing winds waiting for a chance to perform, a club owner slammed the door in his face with a cold, "We're not wasting stage time tonight." And as the door echoed shut, the same shame he felt as a dyslexic child washed over him. The voice of his old guidance counselor hissing, "Education isn't for everybody." His life became a blur of borrowed couches, worn-out jackets, coins counted carefully in his palm, long bus rides through icy streets, and endless hopes pinned to 3-minute sets that delivered nothing but bruised pride. Yet something inside him, a stubborn ember lit in childhood, refused to go out. Every failed joke sharpened his timing. Every rejection toughened his resilience. Every night spent shivering in that freezing car forged the discipline no classroom ever taught. Those years were harsh, hungry, and unforgiving, but they shaped the instincts, compassion, and unstoppable work ethic that would one day astonish the world. Jay Leno didn't rise because the door opened. He rose because he kept knocking long after any reasonable person would have stopped. And finally, after countless bitter nights, something shifted, not in a flash of glory but in a quiet moment in 1977, when he first stepped onto the Tonight Show stage beside Johnny Carson. Under harsh lights, carrying every scar from years of struggle, Jay opened his mouth, and the room softened. Carson smiled, the audience laughed, and a man who once slept in a car suddenly brushed against destiny. The 80s demanded even more. Airports at dawn, highways at midnight, comedy clubs where the smell of stale beer clung to him like shadow. When Carson named him permanent guest host in 1986, the world celebrated, but Jay felt the pressure like a cliff beneath his feet. He feared every misstep, every pause, every line, yet he delivered night after night with the steadiness that had been carved into him since boyhood. Then came 1992, the year when life changed forever. Jay Leno, at age 42, took Carson's chair, carrying decades of grit, pain, discipline, and resilience into the most iconic seat in American television, finally stepping fully into the destiny he had chased through cold cars, cheap meals, slammed doors, and dreams nearly crushed before they ever had a chance to shine. Jay Leno's adult life did not soften after he rose from the hungry nights of Boston and the sting of constant rejection. If anything, hardship tightened its grip with even greater determination, as though life wanted to test the limits of the very man it once tried to break. And in the years that followed his Tonight Show ascension, he built a routine so relentless it became legend, arriving at 9:00 a.m. without fail, flipping through stacks of newspapers until the ink stained his fingers, rewriting jokes again and again until the rhythm pulsed naturally through his bones, then rehearsing until every word felt like a heartbeat. And long after the studio had emptied, while others drove home to rest, Jay drove across Los Angeles to perform stand-up in dimly lit clubs because he believed laughter wasn't something you stumbled into, it was something you earned through discipline and respect for the craft. He was never late, never canceled, and as the years passed, this quiet, stubborn consistency transformed into something magnificent, drawing more than 5 million viewers every night and generating billions for NBC. While at his peak salary of $30 million a year, he cut his own paycheck in half so his staff could keep their jobs, a gesture almost unheard of in an industry built on self-preservation. Yet none of those millions ever saw the version of Jay who sat alone in his dressing room at 1 a.m. surrounded by silence so thick it felt like another universe. The half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside him, joke pages crumpled across the floor like autumn leaves, the building humming faintly as if exhaling after a long day, while Jay stared into the emptiness trying to gather the strength to wake up and do it all over again. Greatness, he learned, is almost never gentle. Fame wrapped around him like a bright but demanding storm. Long hours, merciless scrutiny, and the suffocating fear of failing a nation that had woven him into their bedtime ritual for more than 2 decades. The spotlight was dazzling, the mountaintop unforgettable, but its winds were freezing. Still, he stayed, because he believed making people laugh was not a job but a privilege. And for 22 years he guided America through recessions, recoveries, heartbreaks, triumphs, and restless nights, closing each day with a breath of warmth that cost him sleep, peace, and pieces of himself. Yet he gave it willingly, remembering the young boy who once felt invisible and vowing that no one watching him would ever feel that way. And then came 2014, the night that didn't just end an era, but seemed to hold the breath of an entire nation suspended in its chest. Jay walked onto the Tonight Show stage for the final time, and the applause that erupted wasn't triumphant. It trembled, it wavered, it felt like millions were trying to cling to a moment they knew would never return. He tried to steady his smile, but his voice cracked with a truth he could no longer contain as he whispered, "These have been the best 22 years of my life." And the words broke in the middle, soft and shattered, plunging the studio into a silence so deep it echoed like grief. For the first time in decades, America witnessed the man who had carried their burdens, softened their hardest days, and ended their nights with comfort, allow his own tears to fall. When the camera slowly pulled back, the lights dimming into a gentle haze, Jay stood alone in the place that had held his soul for 2 decades. He reached out and touched the desk with a trembling hand, not as a host closing a show, but as a man saying goodbye to a companion who had walked beside him through storms, victories, and sleepless nights. Then let his eyes sweep over the empty seats, each one holding thousands of nights of laughter he would never get back, and with a final breath that carried the weight of every monologue he had ever written, he turned and walked away, not defeated but with the quiet dignity of someone who had given everything he had. Across America, living rooms fell into a hush. People who had grown old with him, who had leaned on him to soothe the hardest days of their lives, whispered, "Thank you, Jay," not as a farewell to a host, but as a goodbye to a chapter of American comfort, to the reassuring voice that reminded them, night after night, that no matter how hard the day had been, laughter would return. Yet the truth behind Jay Leno's journey was never gentle. There were chapters when his career stopped being a dream and became a battlefield of rivalries, misunderstandings, and unbearable loneliness. None more brutal than 1992 when NBC announced that Jay, not David Letterman, would inherit the most sacred seat in American entertainment. For 15 years, Jay had clawed through the shadows of The Tonight Show, earning trust 1 inch at a time, earning Carson's subtle nods, performing tirelessly, and yet the moment the decision went public, applause didn't follow. Shock did. The press sharpened the rivalry like a knife. Fans argued passionately, Hollywood whispered in dark corners, and suddenly, Jay Leno, the man who only ever wanted to make people laugh, found himself cast as the reluctant centerpiece of a national tug-of-war he never asked for. He didn't attack, didn't defend. He simply worked, even as critics compared every movement to Carson, every joke to Letterman, every moment to someone else's legacy, and for a man once told he wasn't fit for education, those echoes cut deeper than anyone realized. When the storm finally calmed and viewers warmed to his sincerity, NBC reignited everything again in 2004 by announcing, 5 years in advance, that Jay would hand the show to Conan in 2009, a decision Jay accepted publicly with grace, though privately it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Though Jay Leno carried himself with humor and grace in public, privately he bore a truth far too heavy to voice. A truth that one day he would be asked to walk away from the very stage he had poured decades of heart, discipline, and soul into. And in 2009, that truth came crashing into reality when the long-promised transition finally unfolded, forcing Jay to step aside while Conan O'Brien stepped in, marking the first time in 17 uninterrupted years that Jay Leno did not close America's night. Yet the peace that executives predicted never arrived, because as ratings faltered, affiliates panicked, and NBC scrambled, a chain reaction ignited that would explode into the fiercest late-night controversy of a generation, pushing NBC to offer Jay a 10 p.m. show and then propose shifting Conan's Tonight Show to a later hour, a move that triggered not a disagreement but an earthquake across American culture. As headlines erupted, message boards became battlefields, fans took sides with volcanic intensity, and commentators crafted narratives faster than truth could breathe, transforming a simple comedian into an accidental villain in a story he never wrote nor desired to be part of. And as Jay walked past newsstands plastered with grotesque caricatures of himself each morning, he did so with the quiet bewilderment of a man who had spent his entire life trying only to make people smile. Night after night he returned to a dressing room, lit by the unforgiving glare of a single fluorescent bulb, sitting silently with a cooling cup of coffee, reading accusations he did not know how to answer until he finally spoke the soft, exhausted truth. "I'm just an employee, a sentence that revealed the weary soul of a man caught in the gears of corporate machinery and public expectation, a man who, though imperfect like anyone else, was profoundly human and undeserving of the venom directed at him. Yet he never lashed out at Conan, never blamed NBC, never rewrote the story to play the hero or justify himself, choosing instead to remain silent as if hoping the chaos would dissolve if he simply refused to feed it. And when Jay returned to The Tonight Show in 2010, it wasn't triumph he carried. It was weight, a heaviness formed from wounds that no applause could mend. And although viewers welcomed him home, others remained conflicted, shaped by narratives louder than truth. And Jay, who had always measured his worth through laughter, learned painfully that some scars fame cannot mask and some heartbreaks success cannot silence, leading to nights when he lingered in the empty studio after the audience left, staring up at the slowly cooling stage lights and wondering how a man who had devoted his life to doing everything right could still become the lightning rod for so much hurt. But he kept showing up, because surrender would mean allowing bitterness to rewrite the story of his life. And Jay Leno, shaped by childhood rejection, forged in cold cars and empty comedy clubs, would never allow bitterness to claim him, which is why when he said goodbye to The Tonight Show for the final time in 2014, the tears in his eyes did not belong to a victor celebrating conquest, but to a survivor who had weathered storms the world would never fully understand, a man who had discovered that success demands sacrifices the audience never sees, a man who understood that even legends bleed quietly and still rise with grace to face the light again. And as millions watched him fight for composure during that final goodbye, it became unmistakably clear that Jay Leno's greatest achievement wasn't his ratings, his fame, or even his longevity. It was the profound dignity with which he carried himself through battles he never asked to fight, revealing the timeless truth that a person's character is measured not by how they shine in the spotlight, but by how they withstand the storms determined to strip it away. Fame had tested him without mercy, but the battle waiting in the shadows, one with his own body, would soon prove more brutal than anything his career had thrown at him, a silent war he could not outwork, outrun, or outlaugh. And it began quietly in April 2009, when decades of punishing schedules pushed him past the invisible breaking point he never believed he could reach, collapsing suddenly on April 23rd as his legs folded beneath him, and he was rushed to the hospital under harsh emergency lights, the official diagnosis described as exhaustion. Though those who truly knew him understood it was far deeper, a collapse born from 5-night tapings that drained his spirit, weekend stand-up tours that robbed him of rest, unrelenting ratings pressure, corporate warfare, emotional turmoil, and the psychological whiplash of the NBC Succession chaos, all of it carving deeper into him than he dared admit. And under those sterile hospital lights, he was not Jay Leno the icon, the legend, the comedic titan. He was simply a man whose body had slammed on the brakes after years of carrying more weight than anyone's soul should ever bear. He recovered, yes, but a shadow followed him out of that hospital room. A quiet whisper reminding him that even America's most tireless workhorse could break. But after stepping away from The Tonight Show in 2014, Jay sought the only place on earth where the noise of the world could no longer reach him, his garage, a massive sanctum where engines breathed like loyal companions and the comforting scent of steel, oil, and memory wrapped around him like the peace he had spent a lifetime chasing. Jay Leno's garage had always been more than a collection of engines and gleaming steel. It was a sanctuary where time softened into a gentle hush, where dust motes floated like memories, and where the outside world, so loud, so demanding, so unforgiving, faded into a distant murmur, allowing him to breathe in a way he couldn't anywhere else. And from 2015 to 2021, that sacred space flourished as a living museum of grit, perseverance, and dreams, built not from privilege but from long nights, aching hands, and a lifetime of refusing to back down from anything. Each machine whispering chapters of a story he rarely spoke aloud, chapters of resilience, heartbreak, humor, and survival carved into metal and chrome. But even in that peaceful cathedral of engines, even in the place that had become his private refuge, the storm had been gathering in silence. Silent, coiled, patient, was waiting to strike, and on an unremarkable November afternoon in 2022, while repairing a 1907 steam car with the same childlike fascination that had carried him through decades of fame, the machine he loved betrayed him, not out of malice, but out of the unpredictable cruelty of aging machinery, exploding without warning when a clogged fuel line ruptured and drenched him in gasoline, filling the air with the metallic sting of fumes that seeped into his breath, his eyes, his skin, and before he could step back, before he could wipe his face, Before a single second had fully passed, a spark leapt into the air and turned his world into a blinding inferno, flames erupting violently across his face, neck, chest, and hands, with a fury that felt almost alive as heat roared around him, swallowing sound into a single rushing scream of fire, while vision collapsed into a trembling haze of orange and smoke. And in that suspended, merciless heartbeat, Jay felt the world tilt beneath him, felt time fragment into terror, and a single thought rose through the shock. This could be the moment everything ends. As flames climbed his skin with savage urgency, blistering and burning in seconds, pain detonating through every nerve with a force so overwhelming it seemed to tear the world apart. Heat pressing against him until he could not tell where the fire ended and where his own body began, and when the flames were finally beaten down, when he stumbled backward into the smoke-filled air, trembling and half blind, the scent of scorched fabric and burnt oil clung to him like a memory he could never outrun, his skin throbbing with a deep, pulsing ache that radiated outward in relentless waves. And beneath that pain lurked something colder, the terror of not knowing what the fire had taken, what would remain of the face the world knew so well. By the time paramedics reached him, he sat trembling on the concrete floor, breath shallow, hands shaking uncontrollably while medics pressed cool compresses against his burned face and murmured reassurances he could barely hear through the ringing in his ears. And at the burn unit, the hospital lights felt painfully bright and impossibly dim at the same time, reflecting off sterile walls as doctors moved swiftly around him, their calm voices unable to hide the urgency in their eyes as they mentioned significant burns, treatment, possible grafts. Words that drifted through the air like distant echoes he could not fully process. As he stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how everything had changed in an instant, he remembered the crushing quiet of seeing his reflection for the first time, his face wrapped in layers of white dressing, with only his eyes peering out, and the ache that spilled through him as he realized that even though he was still himself, something primal had shifted forever. And then came the grafts. Painful, delicate procedures requiring patience, discipline, and a tolerance for discomfort few ever experience, along with long hours in the hyperbaric chamber where cool blue light pressed against the edges of his vision as he focused on the rhythm of his breath, the fragile thread of hope that steadied him even as pain pulsed through every inch of healing skin. But the nights were the hardest, nights when the raw tightness beneath his grafts felt unbearable, when memories of flames flashed behind his eyelids in sharp, disorienting flickers that jolted him awake, nights when he sat alone with the soft beeping of machines echoing through the dark, each rise and fall of his breath reminding him that he was still here, still fighting, still himself despite the violent moments that nearly stole everything from him. And yet, in an act that defied age, logic, and every human limit, Jay stepped onto a stage 9 days later with a smile that cost him far more strength than the audience would ever understand, his hands trembling beneath his suit cuffs, his face tight with the sting of healing skin, his body echoing with the memory of fire. But he stood there anyway, offering laughter to a world blissfully unaware of how close he had come to losing the ability to smile at all, because the body remembers, flames do far more than scar the skin. And Jay Leno, even with pain still threading through every movement, refused to let the fire become the final chapter of his story. They carved themselves into the memory of the flesh, these traumas, these violent interruptions of an ordinary life, etching reminders deeper than pain, deeper than fear, deeper even than time itself. Reminders of how fragile the human body truly is, and how fiercely the human spirit must fight to hold on when the world seems determined to break it piece by piece. And barely 2 months had passed before life tested Jay Leno again, with a brutality so swift, so precise, and so utterly merciless that it felt almost as if fate itself was tightening its grip around him, refusing to loosen even for a single breath. Because on January 17, 2023, with winter air biting cold against skin still tender from grafts that were hardly finished healing, Jay rode a vintage motorcycle with the cautious, protective hesitations of a man still learning to trust his own body again, nerves beneath recently grafted skin, sparking with faint echoes of heat and memory, carrying the unspoken knowledge that he had only just survived one catastrophe, only to be blindsided by another. When an almost invisible cable stretched low across the path ahead, a thin, lethal line hiding like a trap he never had a chance to see, the impact was instantaneous and violent, snapping him backward and wrenching him from the bike as though the world itself had struck him down, hurling him toward the pavement with such brutal force that instinct, gravity, and pain collided in a split second of helpless freefall before his collarbone shattered, 2 ribs cracked beneath the crushing blow, and both kneecaps fractured with a sharp, sickening finality that rippled through his body, like ancient timber breaking under unbearable weight, leaving him sprawled on the cold ground with shock and agony flooding through him. And as he lay there, bruised skin pressed against freezing asphalt, breath catching in trembling bursts, another pain, colder, darker, tightened around him, the horrifying realization that a body still raw from the inferno was breaking yet again in places he could neither protect nor prepare for, every breath burning like fire, every shift stabbing like jagged glass beneath his skin, each moment stripping away the basic ease of movement younger bodies take for granted without ever acknowledging the gift. And yet, unbelievably, Jay refused to surrender, performing while still in braces, stepping onto stages with the deliberate, steady resolve of a man who had learned that courage doesn't roar. It whispers in the quiet moments when you keep moving even though pain begs you to stop, because that same stubborn flame that kept him alive in freezing cars, through rejection, humiliation, and nights where dreams felt impossibly distant, rose again inside him, undimmed and unbreakable, refusing to let pain decide the borders of his life. But destiny, relentless and cruelly patient, was not finished testing him, and by late 2024, Jay was still healing from fractures that reshaped his stride and burns whose memory tightened across his skin whenever cold air touched him. Yet he refused to hide from the world, refused to retreat into the shadows even as his body begged for rest. And then, on a gray autumn afternoon near Pittsburgh, when the sky hung low and damp leaves clung to softened ground, his battered body met its harshest blow yet, because one misstep on rain-loosened earth sent him sliding, gravity seizing him before he could brace himself as he tumbled down a steep 20-meter slope, the world spinning into a chaotic blur of stone, mud, and frigid wind, while the hillside dragged him downward with cruel speed, his wrists striking a jagged rock with a crack that echoed like breaking bone across the valley, shoulders slamming into the ground, knees scraping across gravel and roots, his hand tearing against earth until a fingernail ripped free under the violence of the fall, sending a jolt of white-hot pain surging up his arm. And when he finally came to rest at the bottom, the sky above looked impossibly far away, distant and indifferent, as if the world had stepped back and left him lying on the cold edge of it, his breath knocked out, his vision flickering at the corners while mud pressed against his cheek, his right eye swelling rapidly with a deep radiating ache that seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart, and beneath all of it, beneath the sharp pain in his wrist, the bruising throb in his ribs, the tearing sting in his hand, another truth whispered through him, chilling and undeniable, the truth of a 70-plus-year-old body that had been burned, broken, bruised, battered, and now punished yet again in ways no one his age escapes without consequence. For a fleeting moment, he felt a fear he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. The fear that even the strongest spirit cannot always protect the flesh that carries it. But Jay Leno had never been a man who stayed down. Not in his youth when he slept in freezing cars, not in his prime when pressure crushed him like stone, and not now on a lonely hillside with pain flaring through every joint and bone, gritting through the shock. He pushed himself upright with his uninjured hand, cradling his broken wrist against his chest as he steadied his breath, his balance and his resolve, rising slowly with his face throbbing with every heartbeat, refusing to let the fall define him, the climb back up the hill painfully slow, each step a negotiation with agony, every inch a battle. But he made it, inch by inch, proving once again that a human spirit forged across decades of storms can rise even when the body trembles beneath it. And when doctors confirmed the damage, a fractured wrist, deep facial bruising, a torn fingernail, and contusions that would sideline a younger man, Jay greeted the news not with fear or despair, but with the same quiet steadiness he carried his whole life, accepting it without dramatics, without complaint, fully aware that life does not always warn before it strikes, yet choosing, once again, to rise anyway. And that real strength, the kind the world rarely notices until it becomes impossible to ignore, is never found in the easy moments when life lets us stand tall, but in the agonizing, trembling moments when we choose to stand up again after the world has done everything it can to push us down. And Jay Leno, aching, bruised, stitched together by determination rather than ease, hurting in more places than he could count, still returned to his commitments with the same gentle, familiar smile that had carried America through decades of long nights, proving that the body may stumble, bones may crack, skin may burn, and age may wrap itself around a man like a quiet storm, but the spirit, when forged in fire and sharpened through a lifetime of trials, does not yield, because Jay's true battle was never with burns or fractures or slopes of slippery earth, but with something far heavier, far lonelier, something every aging man faces silently in the mirror, the moment the body begins to betray what the heart still burns to do. The quiet terror older men never voice aloud. The fear that strength once taken for granted may slip away grain by grain, leaving behind a shell that cannot keep up with the fire still raging inside. And yet Jay met that truth not with bitterness or despair, but with a courage so gentle it hurts to witness. The courage to keep moving in a body that no longer obeyed the way it once had, to rise knowing every step may ache, to face each day not as a guarantee but as a gift. He kept going when it stung to breathe. He kept showing up when standing took effort most people would never recognize. He kept smiling even when the muscles beneath that smile tugged against skin that remembered flame, impact, and the cold floor of an emergency room. And in that quiet defiance he offered a lesson deeper than any monologue, deeper than any headline, deeper than any joke he ever wrote. That growing older is not a fall from grace but a test of the soul, a test many fail, because they believe pain is defeat, when in truth it is only proof that we are still alive. Age may bend the body, pain may slow the stride, but as long as a person can lift even one trembling hand toward the day ahead, they have not lost, they have lived bravely. And sometimes the bravest thing any of us can do is rise again carrying everything that hurts, everything that scares us, everything time has taken, and still whisper with whatever breath remains, I am still here, and I am still trying. And in the quiet center of all this suffering, this burning, breaking, healing, falling, rising, there lived another story, softer but even more powerful, a story not of pain but of devotion, not of scars but of love, the kind of love that does not collapse when life becomes violent, the kind of love that stands like a lantern in a hospital hallway, small but unwavering, steady even when everything else goes dark, because some love stories arrive like early breezes of spring, soft and shy, and some explode like fireworks, dazzling but brief. But the love between Jay and Mavis Leno belongs to the rarest kind, the quiet kind, the quiet kind, the kind that glows in the spaces where no one is watching, the kind that asks for nothing and gives everything, the kind built not on spectacle but on shared breath, shared silence, shared endurance. They met in the early 1970s at the Comedy Store when Jay was a young comedian sprinting between stages in a wrinkled jacket and shoes worn thin at the heels, and Mavis was the sharp, brilliant young activist watching him from a small table near the back, seeing something in him long before the world ever would, recognizing him not with lightning or fireworks but with a quiet, undeniable knowing that whispered, "This is my person." And after the crowds dissolved and the neon lights flickered across Sunset Boulevard, they walked side by side under the cool Los Angeles night, talking about dreams they never believed would come true. He speaking shyly about maybe one day having his own show, she speaking passionately about her mission to fight for women whose voices the world had stolen. Jay was poor then, painfully poor, with elbows wearing through his sleeves, pockets too light for a warm dinner, his car rattling like a rusty tin can begging for mercy. But Mavis loved him not for what he had but for who he was, a man whose kindness shone through the noise of comedy stages and whose humor hit a deep and gentle soul. Their wedding was small, quiet, unadorned by glitter or spectacle, just a simple ring, a soft vow spoken with trembling sincerity, and two hands clasped as if anchoring each other against a world that never stopped rushing by. And that was more than enough. Over the decades their love changed shape but never its center. As Jay's fame grew and late-night tapings pulled him away from home, there were evenings when the kitchen light glowed over a cup of untouched tea as Mavis waited, listening for the jingle of his keys in the door. Evenings when the house felt less like a home and more like a train station built for comings and goings, waiting for a man too tired to talk by the time he finally arrived, dropping his bag with a sigh as ratings and monologues still clung to his shoulders like invisible weights. She worried for him but never complained, simply warmed his food, sat beside him, asked about his day, and let him sink into silence when his eyes drifted far away, and he never stopped asking about her world either, her activism, her victories, her battles, the women she fought for without cameras or applause, because there were two people who chose each other every day without fame, without flash, without needing to prove anything. They chose not to have children, a decision that felt simple in their 30s, comfortable in their 50s, but in later years settled into the quiet spaces of holidays that were too still, dinners with too few chairs, hallways without the echo of running feet, a soft unspoken ache neither of them voiced but both felt in the fragile stillness of aging nights. And yet even that silence could not undo the depth of what they built together, a life shaped by devotion, steadiness, and a love strong enough to carry them through every storm time had prepared. And as illness quietly crept into the quiet corners of their lives, that missing pair of hands, the invisible son or daughter who might have stepped forward and whispered, "Dad, "I've got this," who might have filled the empty chair beside him, became a silent, undeniable absence that echoed through every decision and every exhausted breath Leno took, and then early 2024 arrived, like a slow, unstoppable tide, shifting the ground beneath them so gradually that the first signs could have been mistaken for forgetfulness, like Mavis misplacing a book she swore had vanished, or confusing Monday for Thursday, or losing her place in a story she had told only minutes before. Tiny threads slipping through her fingers, while Jay tried to laugh it off the way people do when they are desperate to believe time is still kind, but he saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her gaze hovered just past his shoulder before settling on his face, as if her mind needed an extra beat to remember exactly who he was. And one day when she rose too quickly and nearly fell, Jay rushed to catch her, bending on the knee that had cracked under him months earlier in the motorcycle accident, swallowing the stab of pain as she clung to him, trusting him completely, unaware that the body holding her steady was breaking in its own quiet, devastating ways. After surviving the fire that burned his skin tight, the fractures that ached in cold air, the fall that battered him bruised and breathless, Jay believed he understood pain, but nothing prepared him for the stillness in the examination room when the words advanced dementia settled between them. Like a verdict carved in stone, he did not cry there. He simply reached for her hand, though his wrist still throbbed from the fracture he had barely recovered from, and whispered that he would take care of her. But on the drive home, twilight slipping down the windshield in streaks of fading gold, she turned to him and asked softly, "Where are we going?" And though he answered gently, she asked again minutes later with the same earnest confusion, as if the first answer had dissolved into air, and something inside him cracked, not with the violent snap of bone or the searing sting of fire, but with the slow, crushing ache of a man realizing he is losing the person he loves piece by piece, memory by memory, moment by moment. That night, he steadied himself by opening their wedding album, placing his trembling hand over a photograph of the two of them, young and radiant and unbroken, holding it there as if he could press the past back into the present. And it was the closest he came to crying, because this was a battle he could not outwork, outrun, or outlaugh. A quiet unraveling of the world they had built together, a fading of light he could not stop no matter how fiercely he tried, and so he became her guardian, not just in love, but in the cold language of signatures and legal papers, signing documents with a hand that shook, each signature a small surrender to a future he would have given anything to rewrite, establishing trusts, making arrangements, sitting through meetings where doctors spoke gently of decline in care and inevitable loss, while the chair beside him remained empty. The chair a grown daughter or son might have filled, while he buttoned her blouse with fingers still stiff from skin grafts, steadied her down the stairs with one hand under her elbow while his own aching knee threatened to buckle beneath him, wrapped his arms around her when she panicked, because a familiar hallway looked strange, whispering, "I'm right here," even when his ribs tightened in protest. And on evenings when her world felt especially foggy, he played old Tonight Show tapes, the younger Jay pacing behind the desk on the screen, delivering monologues that once tucked America into bed, and Mavis would laugh at the man on the screen, saying, "He's funny," while Jay watched her instead of himself, replying softly. He tried his best, and sometimes she would slip her hand over his, not because she remembered every year they had shared, but because somewhere deep inside her heart still recognized the warmth of his touch, while on other nights she would study his face with gentle confusion and ask, "Have we met?" And he, who had spent a lifetime being recognized everywhere he went, swallowed the ache and smiled with unwavering tenderness, saying, "Yes, sweetheart, we've known each other a very long time. It's me, I'm Jay," and there were no children to steady his arm or say, "Dad, I'll take the night shift," no grown son to shoulder the paperwork, no daughter to help make impossible decisions, just the two of them moving through the dimming glow of fading memory, instead of the bright spark of rising youth. The house once loud, with late-night returns, now filled with the soft shuffle of slippers, the clink of pill bottles, and Jay's tired but patient voice explaining for the third or fourth time what day it was or where they were going, as the world outside turned faster than the world inside their home. And through it all, he stayed beside her with a devotion so steady it broke the heart, a love so quiet and unshakable it illuminated their home more brightly than any spotlight ever had. He sorted her medications at the kitchen table in the soft, slanting light of late afternoon, his stiff fingers moving slowly but carefully over each pill, as though the simple act of organizing them was a final defense against the unstoppable tide of time that kept pulling pieces of her away from him. And at night he sat by her bed, watching her sleep, tracing the silver threads in her hair and the soft lines across her cheeks, as if he were trying to memorize every detail before memory itself could steal them from both their hands. Some days they walked slowly through the garden, their steps uneven and hesitant, her balance unsteady, his knees throbbing with each small incline as old injuries sent up quiet flares of protest, yet they walked together anyway, hand in hand, two aging silhouettes held upright by the same vow they had whispered to each other decades earlier when life was full of light and laughter and time still seemed merciful, and in those trembling hours, in hospital corridors that smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion, in the dim glow of their kitchen after another long day of confusion, in the moments when she looked at him and saw a stranger instead of the man she had loved for 50 years, Jay learned the lesson no stage, no spotlight, no audience could ever teach him. That love is not proven during the bright seasons when life is easy and the future feels endless, but in the fragile, unraveling chapters when bodies weaken, memories fade, hearts bruise, and the simplest, most instinctive thing would be to step back, yet instead you move closer, lean in deeper, and anchor yourself to the person who once anchored you. The world may remember Jay Leno for his jokes, his cars, his monologues, and the legacy he built night after night as millions tuned in to hear his voice. But only one woman ever knew the real man beneath the applause, and she is slowly forgetting him. He spent a lifetime making America remember his name, and in the quiet corners of his heart, all he wants now is for the woman he loves to remember him, if only for one more morning, one more hour, one more heartbeat. And even if one day she no longer does, he will still sit beside her, still lace his trembling fingers through hers, still whisper, "It's me, I'm right here," into whatever silence remains, because real love does not require memory to survive. It only requires presence, patience, devotion, and Jay has given every last unbroken piece of himself to Mavis, one quiet, courageous day at a time. And if life contains chapters written in tears, then the most devastating chapter Jay ever faced unfolded over nearly a decade when he lost three pillars of his world, his mother, his father, and his brother, all to the same ruthless enemy, cancer. It was a decade that slowed his heartbeat and carved deep shadows under his ribs, a decade where grief knocked again and again without pause, as if pain had learned his address and refused to forget it. And in that decade, cancer became more than a diagnosis. It became an echo that followed him from one hospital room to the next, a shadow that tightened around his chest every time a doctor took a slow breath before speaking. It first stole his mother, Catherine. After years of quiet battle fought with the kind of grace that breaks a man only after she's gone, she never let him see her fear, hiding it beneath soft smiles, lavender-scented sweaters, and the warmth of a kitchen where she made their modest home feel like a sanctuary. And Jay often remembered coming back from brutal stand-up sets, bruised ego, tired bones, only to find her waiting with a chipped plate, tapping her fingers like a gentle metronome to reassure him he was still moving forward. "You're getting better, keep going," she whispered on nights when her own strength faltered, and she patched worn elbows on his jackets, tucked small notes into his pockets, and once told him after he failed an exam, "Some people read books, Jay, you read people," and losing her felt like losing the compass that pointed him toward every dream he dared to chase. Cancer took her slowly, the way winter steals the last light from the sky, until one morning, the house felt like it sighed without her. In her final days, he held her hand, listening to her breath catch at the edge of silence, wishing he could trade every joke he ever told for just one more hour with her. And afterward he walked through her home touching recipe cards, her favorite mug, the back of the chair she used to hum Scottish lullabies in, terrified that memory itself might fade if he blinked too long. The world saw a rising star, but inside something essential had come undone. Barely a year later, grief returned with the cruel familiarity of a wound reopening, as if sorrow were determined to dismantle him piece by piece. His father Angelo, his anchor, his steady beam, the unshakable backbone of his family, began his own cancer fight, and for Jay it was like watching the last pillar of his childhood begin to tremble. He visited every day, sitting through the same antiseptic smells, the same mechanical beeps, the same dim corridors where hope moved in uneven steps, and memories flooded him, standing on a wooden crate as a little boy while Angelo angled a flashlight so Jay could see under the hood of an engine, the warm smell of oil, the scrape of tools, the patient voice saying, "If you start something, finish it," a lesson that shaped him more deeply than school ever could. And now to see that same man struggle to lift a cup of water hollowed Jay completely. He straightened blankets, steadied his father's bed, guided his trembling hands, feeling helpless, in a way success could never protect him from. Watching Angelo weaken was like watching the strongest beam in a home bow underweight, a beam that had held everything together while never asking for thanks. And in every hospital visit, Jay realized that the world may measure a man by fame, but a son measures his father by the quiet strength he leaves behind. When cancer claimed Angelo shortly after, grief settled permanently in Jay's bones, and just when he believed the ache could not deepen, it took his brother too, leaving him to navigate a world suddenly emptier than he ever imagined. Loss became a rhythm that shaped him, molded him, scarred him, and still he carried his family forward in memory and in heart. Even as time softened their voices into echoes he would give anything to hear again. Their conversations grew shorter as Mavis's illness advanced, but their silences grew fuller, heavy with unspoken gratitude, unfinished thoughts, and the kind of love that no longer needed words to be understood. And as the days blurred together, each silence became a language of its own, a tender exchange between two souls who had weathered every storm side by side. One night stayed with Jay forever. Angelo, exhausted and drifting in and out of consciousness, closed his eyes mid-sentence, and Jay, thinking he had fallen asleep, quietly rose from his chair. But before he could take a step, his father's trembling hand reached out blindly, brushing his sleeve, whispering, "Don't go yet," in a voice so soft it seemed to fall apart as it left his lips. Jay instantly sat back down, holding his father's weakening hand in both of his, clinging as if that small touch could suspend the collapsing moment in time. When Angelo passed, the world did not roar, it went silent. After the funeral, Jay walked into the empty family home, set his keys on the counter, and heard the echo stretch through rooms that once held laughter and life but now contained two vacant chairs instead of one. The sight struck him so sharply, he had to grip the doorway to stay standing. He walked to his father's chair, the one with the faint imprint of a wallet worn into the cushion, and pressed his palm against the fabric, tracing its texture as if trying to gather every memory that clung to it, whispering a quiet thank you into the stillness, a thank you he knew was both too late and never enough. In that silent room, something inside him shifted. He realized he was now the final guardian of his family's stories, the last witness to a lineage of sacrifice, discipline, and steadfast love, and that truth settled inside him like a stone placed with ceremony, heavy but sacred, something he would carry for the rest of his life. 8 years passed, long enough for grief to scab, never long enough for it to stop stinging, before cancer returned for the last of the three pillars who built his world. His older brother Patrick had been fighting quietly, hiding symptoms, shielding Jay the same way he did when they were kids sharing a cramped bedroom, whispering secrets past midnight, eating peanut butter sandwiches under blankets, dreaming about lives bigger than the walls around them. Patrick was the final link to a childhood unclaimed by fame, pressure, or responsibility. When Jay received the news, just minutes before stepping onto the Tonight Show stage, the backstage chatter collapsed into a hollow hum as if the air itself paused. He visited Patrick through long hospital nights, recounting childhood memories not only to comfort his brother but to anchor himself to the only version of life that ever felt simple. Their last conversations weren't dramatic or poetic, just two brothers holding hands in the small, shrinking space between memory and goodbye. When Patrick passed, Jay walked out into the cold evening and sank into his car, resting his forehead on the steering wheel. He wasn't crying. The grief was too deep for tears. He simply sat there, motionless, suspended in the unbearable quiet of a world that had shifted too violently beneath him, trying to relearn how to breathe. What Jay carried from that decade was not only loss, it was the realization that cancer had threaded itself through the most sacred corners of his life, touching everyone who shaped him. And yet each night he stepped onto the Tonight Show stage, delivering laughter to millions while walking through a private world that had grown hauntingly silent. Fame had offered no shield. Success could not slow time. Life refused to pause for grief. And that became the quiet truth. Strength is not the absence of sorrow, but the decision to keep moving through it. Love lingers in the spaces where memory tries to fade, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing, deliberately and tenderly, to step back into the light after losing so much in the dark. Now, at age 75, Jay Leno stands in a chapter of life quieter and deeper than any stage he has ever walked. A chapter built not on applause, but on endurance, legacy, generosity, and the steady courage of waking up each day, determined to keep moving forward. His body carries the marks of fire, fractures, falls, surgeries, and time. Burn scars that tighten in cold air, knees that ache from old breaks, ribs that remind him of every accident. But the life he has built stands taller than ever. His net worth, estimated at over $450 million, is breathtaking not simply for its size, but for the staggering distance he traveled to achieve it. From a dyslexic boy in a working-class home who counted coins to buy gas, who slept in freezing cars, who wore jackets with worn-out elbows, to one of the most successful entertainers in American history, Jay famously never spent his Tonight Show salary living solely off stand-up income, saving with discipline so unwavering it became legend. His real estate portfolio alone could fill a documentary, properties chosen not for show but for soul, built for work and memory, not spectacle. His Newport mansion stretches across the coastline with sweeping ocean views and quiet rooms filled with natural light, while his two bare residences, purchased in 1987 and 1997, remain modest by celebrity standards, reflections not of excess but of the same grounded sensibility that has guided him his entire life. Through fortune and heartbreak, applause and silence, fire and decline, Jay Leno has lived with one truth etched into him: life is fragile, love is sacred. Time is merciless, and strength is found not in never falling, but in rising again and again, even when every part of you aches. Impeccably maintained and arranged with the kind of quiet intentionality only a man shaped by decades of discipline could master, Jay Leno's world is built around simple comforts. Soft lamps, worn-in furniture, shelves heavy with books, and corners where time itself seems to slow into something gentle. Yet the beating heart of his life sits in Burbank, inside a sprawling labyrinth of interconnected buildings that function less like property and more like the internal architecture of his soul. At the center of this compound are the vast garage hangars, sacred cathedrals of engineering where the air hums with the low metallic whisper of machines dreaming back to life. The main structure holds editing bays, restoration workshops, machine rooms, corridors of polished concrete that echo faintly under the weight of decades, while to the west rises a hangar so enormous it resembles an aircraft depot, its steel beams perfumed with hot oil and old engine breath, and to the east rests a climate-controlled annex containing specialty tools, rare engines mounted like sculptures, and an archive of blueprints, handwritten restoration notes, and mechanical sketches preserved with the reverence of sacred scripture. Inside these sanctuaries rests one of the most astonishing private automobile collections on Earth. Nearly 200 machines spanning eras, technologies, philosophies, and dreams. Priceless antiques glow beside futuristic prototypes. Steam-powered relics shimmer under custom lighting, like relics from vanished centuries, and masterpieces like the McLaren phone, the Lamborghini Miura, perfectly restored Duesenbergs, the Mercedes SLR McLaren, the EcoJet concept car, and steam cars older than American landmarks sit in reverent stillness, each bearing the unmistakable marks of Jay's own hands. A bolt tightened by him, a panel polished by him, a reminder that beneath the legend still lives the boy who once stood atop a wooden crate beside his father's workbench just to reach the hood of an engine. His collections extend beyond cars, motorcycles arranged chronologically like chapters in a living history, vintage machinery restored to working order, early-era tools he still handles with gratitude, jackets from long-ago comedy tours, shelves of handwritten joke books with tape peeling at the edges, cabinets of artifacts tracing the evolution of American entertainment, and through it all, every property he owns remains warm rather than ostentatious, less mansion than haven, a place designed for memory, craft, and the steady hum of engines being coaxed back to life. Yet behind the scale of his collection, Jay lives with a simplicity that astonishes those who imagine Hollywood excess. He still drives himself, still wakes before dawn, still works in denim shirts and old boots, still bends over machinery most men of his wealth would never touch, still ignores the stiffness in his left hand on damp mornings, still pushes through the burn scars that tighten across his skin, still walks despite knees that ache from old fractures and ribs that remind him of every fall he has survived. He performs stand-up with the same devotion he carried at 20, stepping onto dimly lit stages where strangers sit, shoulder to shoulder, hoping laughter might lift the burdens they carried with them into the night. For Jay, comedy has never been escape. It is oxygen, the final thread connecting him to the world as it once was. And just as quietly he gives away millions without headlines or ceremony, slipping a folded check into a veteran's hand and whispering, "Please don't tell anyone," funding surgeries for strangers who never learn his name, supporting families in crisis, donating to emergency medical funds, burn centers, children's hospitals, engineering scholarships, veterans programs, living the philosophy he often repeats with disarming simplicity: if you have more than you need, you take care of people. Because he and Mavis never had children, he built a meticulously detailed living trust, ensuring her care before all else, then directing his entire fortune towards scholarships, community foundations, medical research, and charities shaped by the values whispered into him by his parents at the kitchen table. Yet his life remains touched by sorrow, scars that tighten when he buttons his shirt, a knee that flares each time he stands to steady her, a breath that catches on cold mornings where fractures still whisper their old bruises. And every day he faces the quiet heartbreak of Mavis's fading memory. The woman who once knew every corner of his mind now drifting through moments like a traveler moving through a soft, dissolving fog. But even in this, there is tenderness. Jay cooking her breakfast with a stiff hand steadying the pan, reading to her in the gentle afternoon light, guiding her slowly through the garden while whispering her name whenever she loses hold of it. Devotion, he has learned, is not measured by ease but by endurance, by the vow to stay when life becomes harder than either of you ever imagined. And he stays not because it is easy, but because love, in its most sacred form, never walks away. And so, perhaps Jay Leno's truest legacy is not the fame, not the cars, not the fortune, but the unwavering courage of a man who keeps showing up, a man who teaches us that success is built quietly, one determined day at a time, that love persists even as memory fades, that family lives on in the choices we make long after those we love have gone, that age, though lined with pain, can still shine with dignity, that tenderness is strength, and that rising each day, no matter how heavy the world becomes, is its own kind of triumph. And as this chapter of his extraordinary life closes, may his story remind you of your own strength, the battles you have fought, the victories you have earned, the losses you have survived, and the love you continue to carry, even when the world feels unbearably heavy. And tonight, from all of us here, may you, the wonderful viewers of Golden American Stars, be blessed with peace, health, happiness, and abundance. May your days be gentle, your nights warm, and may every dream waiting quietly inside your heart find its way into the light and into the life you deserve.